Dr. Jonathan L. Lee, thank you ever so much for accepting to come on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been a long time coming. We've been back and forth and trying to get you on, and you're all the way on the other side of the world. But I'm really grateful.
That's the problem. No, no problems. Finally managed to get together.
Absolutely. I mean, we did have a get together in Oxford, and we had some nice,
Yeah, well, we
nice
very
Lebanese
nice.
food. Um,
Excellent. Yes.
before we go into Afghanistan's story, let's do a bit of Dr. Lee's story with Afghanistan. How did it begin?
Oh gosh. Well, that's an hour story.
We've got all the
So
time. I've got all the time.
well, I first went to Afghanistan in 1971 when I was an undergraduate, and did a sort of like a 6 week or 4 week tour, and I I I was in Leeds University in the Religious Studies department doing um, and studying, mostly focusing on the Islamic world. And I was going to write my dissertation on the idea of ummah, the idea of
Yeah.
community in Islam. And I'd, I'd met somebody, actually in our local church, whose father was heading up an NGO in Afghanistan, and and I had thought of going to India or in Pakistan anyway because I've always had an interest in that area, and obviously my studies had brought out a lot more of that. And I'd also they've been talking then about the Gandharan civilization, and
Yeah.
how the Buddhist um, transformation took place along the road up through the Khyber Pass and so on. So I just got fascinated with it, and so I said, okay, I managed to sort of scrape a bit of money together and jumped on a student flight to Bombay or Mumbai, and yeah, sort of worked my way up to Afghanistan. Um, Mostly just trying to get in contact with Muslim civilization, as it was, rather than just learning from books and reading about it in books and the theory. I just wanted to see it in practice and see what it meant. The other thing behind it is that actually my family has a background in the Muslim world. My father worked in the Sudan
Mm.
um, as part of the kind of colonial mandate. At a very, very low level, he was in the railways. So that's always been kind of like a part of our heritage. So it was kind of like trying to re-engage with that as well. So yeah, so I spent, I think, about 4 weeks in Afghanistan and did the normal thing. I did the trip up through Bamiyan and up to Mazar-e Sharif and back down again. And I think it was quite a transformational experience, really, for me. And I just felt really this is really where I want to spend some time.
So what was it? When you say transformational, and other people on this podcast as well have used the word Afghanistan being intoxicating, not to mention the hippies getting themselves intoxicated in
Well,
Afghanistan along the route.
it's a different kind of intoxication.
Yeah, but what was the transformation about? I mean, how did you find it? Did you do the hippie stuff as well, or it was just
Oh,
the academic stuff?
oh no, I was very sort of straight sort of guy, everything. Uh, I was a teetotaler. I'd been brought up in quite strict sort of Christian tradition, so I was sort of being a good boy.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it was interesting because I did actually meet somebody in the UK who's actually, I'm still friends with, an Australian girl who actually was on the hippie trail. Um, and she told me a lot about what was going on there and everything else. But went and saw Chicken Street and Siggy's Chips. I've still got a photograph of the stall there selling chips. But I was more interested in the encounter that I had in rural areas with just ordinary Afghans. We went up to Istarlif and um, in Hazarajat. I did a 2 week course in basic conversational Dari, and went with the friends of ours who also did the trip. So I think it was just transformational in the sense that it the people, the hospitality, just the cultures, the the scenery as well, and also its ancient history. I'd always been involved in sort of local archaeology. I'd done um, I was interested in Middle Eastern archaeology as part of my degree, and yeah, the archaeological heritage of the country also really amazed me. Obviously Bamiyan, but Kabul itself, the Bala Hissar. Uh, so yes, it just became a part of what I wanted to do and I felt I should be doing with my life. Um, so I then after the university I worked for a while and saved a bit of money, and my first wife, and I moved out in, I think it was 1975, 76. And I did a course of Persian language and history in Kabul University, but I also had private tutors as well. And that was really the process, really that started my engagement with Afghanistan. Um, and yeah, the rest is, I guess, history.
And from the eye of a young Westerner, um, the height of the Cold War in the West, and of course Afghanistan by then wasn't really part of it in a sense that it became. How, in your observation, how rudimentary, for example, life were you know, for the Afghans outside Kabul, for example, and of course Bamyan, which was kind of, not as developed at the time. I mean, it wasn't really as developed as it was, recent. But so how did you find this?
I, I mean, I found it was amazing. I think it was very, very much subsistence economy, certainly out in the rural areas. I mean, the towns. I mean, Kabul, Mazar, um, were very, very different places to what they are today. They were fairly low key places. I think a lot of sense of identity there. There was very few refugees and so on, and movements of migrations, of inward migration that took place when after the communist takeover and so on. So I think it was a very different society. People would engage with you. You could talk. I mean, there was always people who wanted to try out their English. I think the hospitality culture was very much something that impressed me. I really like Kabul. I met some very interesting people. My tutor, one of my Dari tutors, we've been lifelong friends. He died 3 years ago,
Oh,
unfortunately. He was living in Birmingham, but actually, when I was in Britain in November, I actually went and saw his family, his children and grandchildren, and we're still very close. In fact, I've been communicating with their with one of their relatives, their in-laws, who's actually in Washington at the moment, DC. Um, so yeah, I think the long-term friendships, the culture, the local history. I think just it seemed to be a very hospitable society, it's a hospitable place, and yeah, the towns were a lot smaller, of course. I mean, I think Kabul was probably 500,000 people, Mazar perhaps 200,000. So a lot more compact, and nothing like the urban sprawl that happens today. And of course, I knew people already there. I was, taken in and fed, and people welcomed me. So there, I sense had an open door, which probably a normal tourist wouldn't have had. They would have just gone through some hotel and sat there. So yeah, things were very, very different. I think society was a lot more coherent. There's a lot more social relationships going on. Um, I think things have quite badly broken down in that respect over the
Yeah.
last 30,
And
40 years.
we just we mentioned the hippie trail. Before we get into the historical perspective on the country, just out of curiosity, how did this hippie trail thing become a thing? And when did it start?
It started back in the 60s, mostly, I think, by the influence of some pop stars like the Beatles who went off, to the ashrams and spent time there. And then they started to introduce sort of Indian music, and people like Ravi Shastri and so on coming in. Um, it became a thing that you could do. If you're a student, if you're poor, didn't have that much money, you could basically hitch a ride all the way from London or Paris or Berlin to India because
Hmm.
the roads were open. And I actually did that route, 1974, I think it was, with, it was quite an amazing thing, And you could live very cheaply, you could live on about $5 a day. So, it just became a big thing. And it's amazing, even now in New Zealand, I meet people who say, oh, I was in Afghanistan when I was, it's amazing the number of people that I meet who did the hippie trail or, the sort of cheap trail. But of course, by the time a lot of people arrived in Afghanistan, a lot of them had basically got no money. Some of them were on drugs, and there was a massive problem. And the government, particularly under Dawood, was just like tearing its hair out about what we're going to do about these people because they wanted to have tourism. They saw it, tourism was like one of the ways of getting hard currency in a country which was struggling. But they wanted the high end stuff, they wanted the big
Not the
guys to go
hippies
in.
without money.
Yeah. And I quote in the book actually the American ambassador's sort of response to the hippie thing, and he talks about them as drug frazzled hippies.
Yeah, and I
uh,
think the prevalence of charas as well. It would given how prevalent it has been in Afghanistan, it wouldn't have helped the country, either. The former British ambassador to Afghanistan, who also Sir Nick Kay, who also went to Afghanistan in the
all
70s,
right,
and he
yes,
said,
yeah.
soon as he was not, on the hippie trail, he said he was on the trail of the hippies.
Right, yeah.
As you do. And so, he
With the
says,
occasional, yeah,
yeah.
maybe he was just trying out the local products as well.
So interestingly, he said the moment I entered Afghanistan from Pakistan by the border post, the first Afghan soldier that I met, and he just came round to me and said, "Do you want some chars?" So he wanted
Yes,
to make some money.
it was endemic, and I mean, chas is not a big thing amongst Afghan society. I mean, charsis, the
Yeah.
guys. I mean, some of the Sufis are charsis, and it's very common when you have musicians. They'll take chas beforehand, but it's kind of like almost like having a smoke in
And
those
the lorry
days.
drivers.
And the lorry drivers, indeed, yeah, which was actually quite scary. They were bad enough drivers as it was.
Yeah.
But there was some people call it recreational, but the hippies and not just the hippies, but I mean a lot of foreigners saw it as like, I mean it was the drug craze. It was the beginning of the sort of the drugs movement and the drug epidemic in America and in Western Europe. And you could people would get it free. I mean, I one story I tell you, in 1977 I was doing a research trip to Maimana,
Yeah.
and I was traveling by local transport. So I was in this Russian Jeep, and uh, we were coming into Shirin Tagau, and the guy I was sitting in the front seat because I was the Maimon,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Guess the
the,
name.
the
So,
guy next to me was the local police commander from Shirin Tagau, and they got out and everything like that, and I saw him just as he was getting out. He put something in my backpack, and so I let him go out, and I looked at it after I got out, and it was just a packet of chaps, and I thought I could be in serious trouble here. So that went out the window. The assumption, unfortunately, was that any foreigner basically, that's what they're there for. And I think that was one of the big things I think really got up. A lot of Afghans upset a lot of Afghans that their country had been defined by, these hippies and by drugs that subsumed what Afghanistan and what Afghans really were.
Mm.
People who are hospitable, who are welcome, who wanted to talk about their culture and have people come and see things like Bamiyan Buddhas and take part in the wider cultural engagement. And it was a massive problem for the government as well. I mean, I was indirectly involved, as you do. There was a group called, oh, I can't remember what they were called, Christian group that were there, who were basically, the government gave them permission to come in and deal with all these hippies, and they were
Correct them.
deep.
Correct you hippies. Come here and correct them.
Yeah. Well, they were basically trying to, not only just trying to take them in but sort them out because a lot of them had lost their passports. I mean, we actually took in two Australian girls who I met in Chicken Street, and they were having a really horrible time because their passports had been stolen, all their money had been stolen in the sort of cheap hotel that they were in, and they were absolutely frantic, and the police was there and everything like that. And by that time, I spoke reasonable Farsi, so I just said, can I help and what the problems were. And they seemed pretty decent people, they
Yeah.
were not, sort of drug addicts. And so we actually took them in, and we kept, well, they were our guests, and my wife and I and kids for a couple of months while they sorted out their passports. They got more money from their parents, were quite wealthy, I think, and everything like that. But it was a really, really serious problem. And this particular group sort of basically got themselves, sorted out, and they helped these hippies. Some of them, we buried them
Oh.
in the cemetery. They died, of course, they lost their passports in the Clavri Goro in
Mm.
Kabul. There were just a load of unmarked graves. Nobody knew who these people were. They'd lost all identity. And there were parents coming in, ringing, trying to get hold of their embassies. Frantic. It was my son, my daughter. Where are they? Do you know if anything about this, about them? And yeah, it was a really pretty bad time for a lot of people. There's a book, I think they wrote it, guy who's called, hang on, Floyd McCung, just off
Mm.
Chicken Street, about, I actually don't even have that book in my library. I need to get hold of it and read it.
Oh, I need to get hold of that as well. So I mean, is the author still around or?
I think he might still be alive.
Okay, yeah.
He
So
he
let's see
went
if I
off
can
and
track him down.
he became quite a big sort of thing in the American kind of Christian world, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Started an organization called Youth with a Mission, but initially I think it was just a group of guys trying to do something about the hippies, and most of them, well, quite a lot of them were Americans, some Brits and Germans, but a lot of them were Americans. And of course, the kind of the drug culture then took off in the States, and much to the annoyance of the American administration. And yeah, and then of course they started getting the heroin trade and things. So yeah, it was a difficult time. You'd see these guys wandering around the streets completely in sort of drug hazes, and it was very sad, really.
As you see in bigger city centers now with the, drugs epidemic, it's, this zombie-esque human, in a sense,
Mm.
tragedy that, that tells us so much about human condition in the modern world, I suppose.
But I think it's a side effect of the dislocation of society, of people losing families and everything. I've got photographs of in the frontier, northwest frontier, just the other side of the line of drug addicts completely sort of blown away and just lying like corpses in the street, and heroin on sale openly
Hmm.
in you know it has had a terrible impact on Afghan society and on Pakistan society as well. It's just created serious problems, social problems, and I think still is a problem today. But yeah, I can remember under the Pulisuk Bridge and places
Yeah,
like that. It's
yeah, yeah. I mean,
terrible.
so getting back to the country's history. Uh, Now, your book, Afghanistan: A History from 1260 to the Present. Now, one would assume, as it is generally considered, Afghanistan's history, in a sense, begins with Ahmad Shah Durrani in the 1740. So, what makes Afghanistan for you to go back all those centuries earlier? What is it?
Well, when you go back to okay, so I think it's how do I say it? It's probably not historically accurate to say Afghanistan began in the 18 in 1747 with the
Yeah.
what is essentially a coup d'état that took place in Kandahar on the back of the demise of the Safavid and the Mughal Empire. Ahmed Shah has a history. He had a family. He had background. The tribe that he came from, the clan that he came from, the Khail, the Sadozais, they go right the way back into the whole sort of Mughal Safavid competition for the control of the trade routes, and particularly in Kandahar and Herat. Um, and then if you look back into the history, you keep finding the word Afghan appearing, for example, in the Ghaznavid period of these Afghans being part of the militia of the Ghaznavid army. So what I've tried to do is to give a wider context. My one of my questions was when I, as always has been, the more I've studied
So
Afghanistan,
just
is
just a
that
quick interruption, so apologies.
yeah, carry
When
away.
you see Afghanistan in this context, you mean the tribally Pashtuns, the ethnic Pashtuns, rather than the Afghan that we know today?
It's a long discussion.
Yeah.
Where did historically does the word Afghan and Pashtun are they synonymous? I think that's a serious question that is debated and debatable. What I tried to do was to look at the way in which Afghanistan was formed. I mean, we don't find the word Afghanistan being used anyway until probably the earliest, the late 18th century. And it was really the Elphinstone mission that really started to refer to the country as Afghanistan. So the question is when you're writing a history of Afghanistan, where do you start? Do you start with what essentially the nationalist discourse that was promoted by the state with Ahmed Shah Durrani in 1747, which in a sense is part of an attempt to legitimize the government and the Durrani Abdali supremacy? How Afghan or Pashtun that is a subject of great debate that's going on at the very moment, and that is a contested identification. So when you talk about where do you start the history of Afghanistan, well, for me it goes back to the idea of Afghan, mostly Ghilzai involvement in the conquest of India, the Islamization of India under the Ghaznavids, possibly even further back. And that kind of heritage is quite often referred to in some of the sort of historiography that evolved in the 50s and 60s and 70s. This whole idea of sort of glorifying the Ghaznavids, and it is an involvement that seems to have had an important impact on the way in which Afghanistan or the governments of Afghanistan saw itself and how it defined its own state culture. So, where do you start? For example, any country. So, I mean, like Great Britain, where do you start? Do you start with 1066 and the Battle of Hastings and the conquest, the Norman Conquest, which is essentially basically an
Nowadays, we
occupation
normally
by a
call it
foreign.
Brexit.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could look at it as an invasion by a foreign power that's occupying your country. Or do you go back to the Anglo-Saxons? Do you go back to the Arthurian myths? Do you go back to, uh, to the Anglo-Saxons and or the Danes or the Jutes? So you have to start somewhere. And I wanted to put the Afghanistan into a context that went beyond or further back than just Ahmad Shah Durrani. And so many histories on Afghanistan just starts off with Ahmad Shah Durrani, and there's usually a bit about, who he was, what he was, but no real analysis of what actually happened in 1747. So the first chapter really examines that, the context of the Sardozai's alliance with the Safavid Shia monarchy, their own internal divisions, which were very bloody, and how, for example, Ahmad Shah himself was actually very lucky not to have been killed in the womb by a revolt in Herat, which led to his father being killed and his mother fleeing to Multan. Also, there's that Multan connection that is very strong. The fact that it was a Multan, Sardozais were ruling Multan up until the Sikh conquest. All this, I think, is something that has never really been examined in the history of the wider issue of Afghanistan. So I wanted to bring that whole perspective onto what happened in 1747 and answer the question why, how. And hopefully at least I've started a discussion on that whole issue. 1260, it's basically an arbitrary figure, as probably as arbitrary as 1747. I could have gone back even earlier to the Bactrian documents where we have the first reference to the word Afghan that we know of, who were horse raiders, and we don't know what this word means. Who are these Afghan that are mentioned in the Bactrian document? The same as the Afghans that we know today. So we don't know because the word disappears from the record up until probably till the Mughal period. So really what I wanted to try is start hopefully questioning and examining where the roots of this this state and its monarchy came from, how it looked back to what had gone before, and how, in a sense, it came about primarily almost by chance, due to the demise of actually three major empires: the Uzbek to the north, the Safavid Persian Empire to the west, and the Mughal Empire in India, northern India. And in a sense, Ahmad Shah fills a vacuum that was created by his mentor Nadir Shah as a result of the conquests, which led to the destabilization of all three empires, in fact. So yes, that's really where I'm trying to come from. How it's succeeded, I don't know. I think it has started a debate, at least.
So, he was already a thing. I mean, his tribe was already a thing before, he became the head of that tribe. Now, what kind of a person was he? What kind of people were he surrounded by? I mean, were there a design to build a state? Did he see himself as head of a state per se that encompassed other uh, ethnic groups at the time?
Well, we don't really know much about Ahmad Shah's personality, to be honest. This is really a trend that you find in modern Western history. Who the person was and who his relationships were. I mean, the only histories that they're there are basically dynastic histories written, in a sense, to record his Ahmed Shah's conquests and his successes and so on. He came from a very dysfunctional, the Sardozai clan that he was a member of, or Qaum, was incredibly dysfunctional and was at war with itself frequently. And he came from a minor branch of the Sardozai family, and in fact, actually, in lines of Pashtun inheritance, actually had no claim to lead his tribe. But the infighting and between the two, well, the three or four different clans, he kind of came out on top. But that was almost a coincidence. He was an opportunist when he set up his, he essentially declared independence and set up a state in Kandahar. And the reason that was so was because he was a trusted member of what's called the Ghulam Khana, or the royal guard of Nadir Shah. And he happened to have with him other commanders of other Pashtun regiments who had been conscripted into into Nadir Shah's army after the conquest of Kandahar and Herat. He had this opportunity to basically set up his own administration, and it wasn't, to be honest, anything that we would recognize much as a state. The area is very, very small. But then, of course, he embarked on a whole series of conquests, and by the time of his death, of course, had quite a large empire. And again, exploiting the weakness of both Safavid and Uzbek and Mughal power, which was in decline, serious decline. There was this myth, I think, created back in the 50s that maybe earlier, that somehow or other Ahmed Shah was elected by some sort of Faloui Jirga, that there was this huge sort of like consensus amongst particularly Pashtun tribes that he should become their leader. And if you look at the sources, it's not the case. It was a small group of about 9 men who were military commanders of different factions of different tribes of the Abdali tribe mostly, along with the Khan of Kalat, who was an ally, and they basically set him up as king after quite a lot of debate about who should really be in charge. And it was not particularly large kingdom, but then he embarked on this whole series of conquests, and in a matter of 5 or 6 years, the kingdom had expanded quite remarkably. So the administration itself, such as it was very much run by the Abdali tribe, and but then later, as with the conquest of Lahore and so on, they cut deals with the local Mughal rulers and local governors who changed sides, and in some cases he actually displaced other members of his family from being in power and put in his own supporters. So, the empire itself, of course, became very mixed very quickly in terms of ethnicity, but the way in which the kingdom was managed and ruled, it was all done by proxies. And there was a lot of contention, particularly in northern Afghanistan, with the Uzbek Khans of Bukhara, who contested the occupation of Balkh by Nadir Shah. And any empire is like that. You incorporate all kinds of different peoples within your frontiers. But the tradition was that you ruled through proxies. You didn't actually manage the internal affairs of these regions and yourself. You appointed somebody else, providing they behaved themselves and kept sending the tribute. Everything was fine. But if they revolted, then you sent in an army and beat them up.
And what kind of order were in place in places like, like Hazarajat, for example? or northern Afghanistan. Of course, the Uzbeks were there, and the Tajiks and the Hazaras. What kind of orders were in place for them?
It's strange because what under Ahmed Shah Durrani, as far as I know, and I having this, talking with a few other Afghans about this, that to what extent is the Hazarajat actually mentioned in any of these, and Hazaras are mentioned in any of these early sources, and it seems to be it wasn't, to be honest, that important.
Mm,
It was a place that people bypassed. The only thing I can find is, for example, in Nadir Shah, after his conquest of Kandahar, he relocated one whole group of Sunni Hazaras who came from somewhere north of Ghazni, who had rebelled or given him trouble, basically. After his conquest of Kandahar, he moved on to Herat, to Kabul, but there was a group of Sunni Hazaras up in the, not quite sure exactly where they were, but somewhere up along the Hajjagak road, and they had given him trouble. So he basically sent the whole tribe en masse across to Herat and settled them there. And their commander, or their chief, actually for a while was governor of Herat for Ahmed Shah Durrani. So there is this displacement, but I'm still trying to find out more about the situation in the sort of the wider Hazarajat during this period. And I've just been having a long discussion a couple of days ago with another scholar, an Afghan scholar, who's working on this, and he's saying, well, the only thing that really I can find is that it was the Zohak area,
mm.
which controlled the trade routes north, which was the important thing that keeps getting mentioned in the source. Bamiyan barely gets a mention, and as for Yakolang and the areas west of there, it seems to have just not been on the radar. And one could probably understand that because the real wealth lay in Balkh and in Kabul, Kandahar, particularly Herat, and so on. So you controlled the major cities, and you controlled the trade routes, you controlled the political agenda, and so on.